Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on digital image authentication with Primeau Forensics. My name is Michael Primeau and I am a co-owner and expert at Primeau Forensics. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here. On behalf of my team as well as myself, we are honored and humbled at the opportunity to be presenting to all of you here on Zoom. Today's webinar is going to be fruitful in the aspect of taking a deeper dive into forensic sciences, specifically digital forensic sciences, as well as a case study that we are hoping will be interesting from presentation perspective of right here in our home of Detroit, Michigan. We're going to leave our Q&A open throughout the presentation, and Allison as well as Andrea and my team will be assisting with trying to get your questions answered. If there is a question that is a little more specific to something that I can help with, there will be a time at the end where I will be answering questions, and I'm going to try and do my best to get answers to all of your questions at that time. So my presentation today is intended to be unbiased. So as I testify as an expert in court, bias is one of the things that we try to reduce at all costs. So although the case study that I'm going to be presenting was primarily for the defense, this is not only applicable, this type of science, as well as the work that we do to the defense. We work for prosecution, we work for law enforcement, as well as government agencies. So just wanted to get that out there as a disclaimer. So today's agenda, we're going to be discussing my background and experience. We're going to talk about preservation of digital evidence from a integrity perspective, which is guides and best practices that bear with me one moment. We are having a technical difficulty. Sorry about that. So my goals today are to share more about image authentication as a science, as well as preservation of digital evidence at its core. And that is really what the focus of this, any authentication science is really when we're looking at verifying integrity. As well as present a practical example of how image authentication can be used to help the trier fact, again, the case study that I'm going to be talking about. And this is important now more than ever because everyone has a camera in their pocket. So we're also going to go through the best practices. These are best practices that are set forth by the scientific community, mainly law enforcement, as well as the federal government. And then we're going to go through the case study. So first, to the background and experience. So I've been practicing digital media forensics for a little over 8 years. My father and I are co-owners of the business, and we are probably the only father and son digital media forensics firm in the world. And it's very rewarding to be able to assist the trier of fact to understand more about digital evidence and digital media evidence that's used in court. So I grew up in the digital media business. When I was very young, my father used to bring home computers that I would play with and learn about and take apart, and that paved the way for my engineering focus in my undergrad. And then I began working for him more and more and getting more training from law enforcement. And before I knew it, I was appearing on popular television shows like the Travel Channel as well as the Science Channel. So we do all kinds of work as experts as well as consultants. I've provided consulting for judges, attorney generals. We've had contracts with the DOJ and the DOD, to name a few. And I owe my career to my father, so I wouldn't be here today without him. Before we begin, I want to get some housekeeping things out of the way. So my presentation is not official training. If you are going to be practicing these types of sciences, you do need the necessary training to perform these types of investigations. My presentation is based on objective analysis. So what I'm going to be presenting is not meant to be subjective in any way. This is based on forensic sciences. DME or digital media evidence can be of significant probative value. proving or demonstrating something as evidence. Digital media evidence or digital evidence in general is fragile by nature. And you must know the best practices. These best practices are published on the internet openly, and they are viewable for all parties to be able to interpret and practice and reference. And these best practices that I'm going to be presenting on digital imagery are also applicable to video. So first, we're going to start with digital evidence integrity. In the absence of integrity, the evidence may not be admissible or deemed unreliable. So my role as an expert in the court has been mostly about offering my opinion as to the integrity of the evidence, because there is so much digital evidence that's being provided to the court, whether it be through e-discovery, whether it be through exhibits, or whether it be original evidence that's collected. And it's crucial to understand that digital evidence or digital media evidence by nature is fragile. And this includes the analysis of computers, cell phones, audio and video recordings, image recordings, just to name a few. And oftentimes what we see in the field is that integrity is overlooked, or in a lot of cases assumed. So when a digital recording is created on any type of device and extracted in whatever nature, oftentimes the court interprets that as, okay, well, that was just the one way that it needs to be done and we can take it for fact. And that's not always the case. So what I want to instill as we go through this investigation, and as I'm speaking to you as an expert, something tangible that I hope you take away is that you can begin to think the way that I think when you're examining or when you're interpreting digital evidence, maybe in your own cases or in the courtroom. And that the main principle is that you have to interrogate that evidence. You can't treat any kind of digital evidence as what you see or what you hear if not authenticated properly, especially when we're living in a time where evidence is uploaded through the internet, through YouTube, social media, e-discovery, etc. So there are three major principles when we are talking about digital evidence integrity and forensic examination of that digital evidence. And the first is that all actions taken to collect that evidence should not affect the integrity, whether that's collecting evidence from a cell phone, whether you're extracting images from a cell phone, or interpreting a video recording. The integrity of that evidence is priority when you're seizing it. Persons conducting that examination should be qualified to do so or trained to do so. And oftentimes what we see when recordings are mishandled, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, is that these persons conducting the investigation may be IT professionals that simply got this assignment placed into their lap for collecting that evidence, or maybe they assume that they have the proper training, but as technology evolves, and that evolves on a daily basis, they haven't received additional training to be able to do that collection properly. And all activity relating to the seizure, examination, and storage or transfer should be available for review. So all of the activities done to acquire that evidence should be documented carefully. And that's, again, to ensure that the process has integrity, as well as people like myself or other investigators, or even the trier of fact, can interpret that process and be able to peer review it, which is a requirement in our field. So as we look to integrity, there are a lot of issues that can affect the integrity. Mishandling was one that I had mentioned. Compression for storage, and compression is something where you preserve the size of the recording to optimize space. So you shrink the size of the recording to optimize space. This is very common when we look at digital media. The loss or change of metadata, and metadata is information about information. So it's essentially digital information embedded with the file that we interpret post-investigation very often. Improper documentation at the time of the acquisition. So there were no reports, there were no chain of custody documents filed to be able to understand what the process was for preserving that integrity. Improper acquisition methods. And on the next slide, we're going to be examining an example of what that looks like. Improper training, so not having the right kind of training or not having the training at all to do the procedure, as well as improper copying or storage methods. So this is a real example of a recording that was sent through Gmail on the left, which is highlighted in orange. And then the same recording that was uploaded through Google Drive on the right in blue. And this is an example of metadata. This is digital information that tells us about the circumstances to which the evidence was created. And you can see that there is at the bottom of the blue window, I know it might be a little difficult to see, there is information that indicates what type of device created it, an Apple iPhone 11 in a horizontal photograph mode. And on the left, that information is absent. And that's because when this evidence was sent through the internet, it was changed because the method was not the proper one. And we see this often when you're sharing evidence or you're sending evidence from a phone, is that if it's not handled correctly, that information that is crucial to an investigation to verify integrity or to authenticate it is changed. An additional slide with more information is seen here as we look at the absence of all of that information about what the camera was programmed to, when it was documenting, when it was capturing the image. It's simply absent. So there are several methods that you can employ as an investigator to verify the integrity. And these are, again, from a general perspective. We're talking about digital evidence integrity generally at the moment. And we're going to dig into image authentication here in a moment. Redundant physical original copies. So this is a very simple procedure when done correctly to maintain original data and preserve that evidence so that it doesn't need to have opportunities to be damaged or mishandled, et cetera. Digital signatures. So these are signatures within a recording that verify the integrity automatically. Metadata and EXIF information, that's the information that we were just examining previously, that tells us more information about the circumstances to which the recording or the evidence was created. Watermarking, as well as hash verification, and this is a digital fingerprint that can be verified when a recording is created against other copies, or an evidence is created against other copies. And then, of course, when we're talking about digital media evidence, visual or audible verification. So one example, just so you can get a better idea of how this works, this is a surveillance system that we examined that produced some recordings that we need to recover. And as you can see on the image on the left, there is a date and time signature for this system to verify what time the system was calibrated to. And in order to verify the integrity of that time, we have to examine a real world example of time, which is an image on the right. So let me back up. So this picture that I captured is representing the real world time at that time of acquisition. And this information on the right, this digital information that you see in the metadata, is from that picture. So then I can cross-verify time and I can authenticate the time offset for further investigation. Again, this is just one method to be able to verify time or integrity of the recordings. And if we don't have this, clearly a DVR can be changed. The date and time, as you see, can be changed. And we can't verify or authenticate when certain things happen if we can't verify time. So just to recap, some of the roles that an expert has for digital media evidence or even digital integrity verification is to analyze the data without bias, present the data, then the analysis in a simple way for the court, as well as to answer complicated questions for the court. And that's really what an expert's role is to collect all of this information, interpret it in a simple and easy understanding way, and then to present it. So if some of your brains are starting to hurt, don't click off, stay with me. It's going to get a little bit easier as we start to see the tangible way that we can apply this in the courtroom. But I know that digital analysis can be sometimes complicated. So if you've gotten to this point, excellent. So why me? Why listen to what I have to say? Well, I'm qualified to do so. I'm qualified to present this information because I've had an extensive amount of training in digital forensic analysis to be able to present the information that I've learned as well as the best practices, because at the end of the day, I have a specialized training for this. And that's the reason that you all practice law, or you all do the jobs that you do, because you're good at it. And that's what you're trained to do. And this is what I'm good at. And this is what I was trained to do. So as we talk about digital evidence, we talk about integrity verification, we talk about authentication, we talk about all of these things. Our primary focus, again, something that I want you to take away, is to interrogate the image witness and to not take something that's provided as evidence for fact if it was not authenticated properly. Now, there are a lot of personnel in the community, in the legal community, in the law enforcement community that do know how to do this, experts like myself. But if that person is not qualified to do so, we must interrogate. In this particular case, we're going to be talking about the image witness. So now as we move on to image authentication best practices. In today's digital world, the common problems of tampering in an era of photoshopping have forced the legal system to change. The number of instances of experts being asked to provide some sort of insight regarding the authenticity of a photo have increased at a drastic rate. The courts and savvy attorneys have begun to understand how easy it is to manipulate a digital picture. And this could even be people that submitted the pictures. However, the application of the evidence rules is simply from a pre-digital era is not going to work anymore. And this is why what I'm going to be speaking about is very important and I'm very passionate about. So first we have to establish what our definitions are. So image authentication is used to determine whether the imagery is a true and accurate representation of subjects and events. And this comes directly from the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence. This is also known as SWIG-DE, and one of the organizations that we look to for the majority of our best practices in image analysis, as well as digital media analysis. And it's crucial to abide by these best practices because everyone in the scientific community is supposed to do that. So if we were to perform some sort of analysis or some sort of investigation, the bare bones and the framework for how we do that is the same that another investigator would do, so that it's one, admissible, and two, it's accurate. What can be oftentimes confused for image authentication is image content analysis. And some example questions of how image content analysis is applicable is a specific object present? Maybe asking a question of what happened in the imagery, or where is the scene depicted? And these are also not authenticity-like questions. These are a separate type of investigation, and I could talk about this type of investigation for a long time, but we don't have time for that. So we're going to focus on authentication. But I just wanted to get that out of the way so there's no confusion as examining the events within the image as authentication. And then we go to image integrity verification. So is this an authentic copy? However, this must not be confused with the requirement to demonstrate the integrity of the evidence as a precondition for admissibility to court. Integrity ensures that the information presented is complete and unaltered from the time of acquisition until its final disposition. So, for example, we talked about the hash testing earlier, and that function can verify that a copy of a digital file is identical to the file from which it was copied, but it cannot demonstrate the accuracy of the scene depicted in the image. So as we examine these things, again, we're focusing on image authentication, but integrity verification and image content analysis are really separate things. They're not meant to be equal to one another. So an example case that we can look at for why authentication is important is the People of California versus Beckley. And this was in a county superior court. And the case numbers here, you can read all about it. And this was provided via a software program that we use called Amped Authenticate. And they have a lot of great resources within their software. And one of them is that, and this is mostly law enforcement use type of software that private organizations like myself have access to. But one of the important things as we look at actual case studies is to examine the validity of why authentication is so applicable. And it comes down to, oftentimes, as I said, things are shown for fact in court. And they can be challenged if the appropriate sciences aren't presented. So in this particular case, some photographs were submitted, and I don't remember which side challenged the authenticity of the image, but the court ultimately ruled that the photograph that contained writing required that the writing be authenticated, and therefore the image was not an authentic representation. And that simply wasn't true because image authentication best practices could have been ultimately used to verify the integrity of the imagery. And this was kind of set as a precedent. And this is one of the reasons why this science is so important, to make sure that we present accurate information to the trier of fact. And we don't try to argue over principles that can kind of deceive the court, like image content analysis serving as authenticity testing. So we're going to break it down a little bit into the areas of authentication analysis. And again, this was developed by the leading software company in image authentication called Authenticate. So I don't want to steal their thunder. This comes directly from them. And I use it as an example when I'm explaining image authentication because I think it's very simple to understand. So file format analysis. This verifies that the image is a camera original. So if we get to this point, we can stop here. We can say, okay, I've examined information about the digital image. I verified the camera's properties, that it came from this type of camera. It's consistent with what I would expect to see from an original, and the authentication investigation ends there. However, if oftentimes those recordings are mishandled or uploaded incorrectly or extracted incorrectly, we need to go deeper. Maybe they were extracted from the internet and that digital information is not present anymore. So we look to the global analysis. And this examines the image for global modifications. For instance, if there was the image was resized, if it was recompressed, if it was cropped, these are all things that are indicators that something was done globally to the entire image. Local analysis. So we're looking at individual areas of the image to see if maybe something was copied and pasted or cloned or something to that effect. And then we look to camera identification, and this is probably the deepest level that we can go to, and rarely does it need to get to this point. However, we also, through this type of science, have the ability to verify that and answer a question of, was this particular camera used to photograph whatever it took a picture of through a deeper scientific testing. So we've been talking a lot about mishandling, and some of the ways that these are done either by accident, which we see more often than intentional, is that there's just simply improper preservation methods. So the recording or the image was not maintained properly from the time it was captured to the time it was delivered to court. Improper sending services, so the way that it was handled and sent to different parties, whether that be via email, maybe it was copied to a flash drive, etc., was improper, thus deeming the chain of custody inaccurate. The change of the format or the physical medium. So if we're examining a recording or an image that was created on a cell phone, and then ultimately it was transferred and copied and duplicated onto a CD, that can oftentimes introduce issues with the chain of custody. And then we look at manipulation techniques. And there are all kinds of manipulation techniques, as we discussed earlier in this era of photoshopping, that can very easily manipulate imagery and in some cases preserve digital information, original digital information, that we have to be aware of and be able to identify, such as the alteration through artistic means, compositing, so copy and pasting things and duplicating things and cloning things on images, morphing or transforming elements of an image, let's say adjusting the aspect ratio of a picture, the width to the height, to make something seem thinner or taller than it actually was in the natural events that occurred, as well as image creation. So 3D modeling, this is a big issue in our culture right now when we look at putting someone's face over another with, there's a lot of those political videos, those AI handmade YouTube videos that alter what somebody's saying to say something else. So now we're going to look at some examples so you can get a better idea of how or what to be looking for when we do this type of science in regards to image authentication. So this is a picture that I captured doing an investigation at a dragway. This is one of our clients, and as we look at this example, this imagery is actually edited. And when we look at the digital properties of a recording, there's one major indicator that we look at first, and it's to identify if third-party editing software signatures exist in the image. So the image on the left is the evidence image that was submitted, or the unknown. And the image on the right is the reference image, and they are difficult to tell the difference at a first glance. So the image on the left is the one that is manipulated. That vehicle, the black car, was actually added in. And the image on the right is the original image that was captured naturally. And as we look at the metadata and the digital information, we clearly see in the image that was manipulated, there are Photoshop signatures. And these are digital signatures that tell us the exact software that was used, the date and time it was manipulated, as well as other indicators in the metadata as to what happened to the digital imagery. And the image on the right, all of that image or all that information is absent. We don't see any kind of third-party editing signatures, so we don't think that it was edited in Photoshop, and clearly the one on the left was. And then we look at the file format. We're going to go back to this for a second. I'm going to refer again to the mishandling that I mentioned earlier. When something is uploaded through the incorrect service, we see that there are changes in the metadata, that there is essentially information that's missing about the recorder that created it, or the camera that photographed it. And all of that information you can see is on the right in regards to what type of phone created it, and the image is the image that was uploaded through the improper sending service. That information is absent. Global analysis. So looking at a picture globally to determine if there's any kind of issues or manipulations that were applied to the image. This is actually a photograph of me on another webinar last week that I was presenting for a case, and it's heavily compressed. And we talked about compression earlier, and this is a type of modification or manipulation technique that changes the overall image and reduces the quality of it, but it affects it globally. And the goal of compression is to optimize for space. We're essentially trying to reduce the size of the file to accommodate storage of more of that information on whatever cloud service, storage service, etc. And there's two different types of that. So the type that's bad, that essentially reduces the quality of the image too heavily, in a lot of cases when things are uploaded to the internet, is called lossy. Information is essentially lost. And there is a compression type called lossless that removes duplicate points or redundant information, but preserves the crucial or pertinent information. So this is, again, applicable to a lot of different areas of digital forensics. A lot of things can be compressed. I'm sure you guys have had experience with compression, of shrinking things down to get them to send faster. This is very common, especially when we're uploading things through YouTube, or even previewing things on popular streaming networks such as Netflix. So here's an example of an evidence image that is heavily compressed, which is the image on the left, and then the reference image, or the original, on the right. And as you can clearly see, the closer view of my face is actually indistinguishable in the compressed image, but the details and the characteristics about my face in the uncompressed image are preserved. So we see this a lot when we're sending files. And if those files, the original parameters of that file, the resolution as well as the compression rate, are not preserved, we can affect not only the integrity, but we can also affect the factors to which we need to identify things within the image. So this becomes necessary in a lot of cases. And one of the ways that we can see that forensically is to identify the compression algorithms that are used to shrink the file. And the graph on the bottom, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds with technical information, but the graph on the bottom is an accurate representation of a compression that was more or less done losslessly. And the compression algorithm for the heavily compressed image on the top was done lossy to reduce pertinent information. And we can see that they're drastically different. And this is just one of the indicators that we can use, one of the tests that we can perform to authenticate digital imagery. The next would be an examination of local analysis. And through testing in our software, it can reveal patterns of whether or not things are, let's say, duplicated or cloned. But I'm not going to go too heavy into the way that that works. It's a lengthy process to be able to detect, but I'm going to show you an example. Let's see, I'm going to give you a moment to see if you can identify what might be wrong with this picture. This picture is edited and is manipulated from a local perspective. Okay, have you had a chance to examine it? So for all of our investigators in the room, you likely found it. And if you didn't, it's a very finite detail that might be very difficult to see on Zoom. This image was manipulated with these numbers on the gas pumps. So I actually hand copied these numbers and duplicated it over to these areas, which might not be important to an investigation or might not be a change that someone would make to the pictures, but this is actually real life evidence of a suspect, well, actually two suspects in a shooting. And the numbers on the gas pumps could have been relevant to the investigation, although if they were changed, that will provide inaccurate information to the trier of fact to interpret. So as we look at the ending of the investigation, so as we collect all of this information, what do we do with it? And now I'm going to talk a little bit about reports and opinions. So again, our goal here is to minimize bias. We have to interpret the data. We have to collect the data, analyze it, and make sure it's a simple understanding for the trier of fact. I remember the very first time I testified, and we are told this in our training, you know, when you're addressing the jury and you're presenting technical information, spend half of your attention making sure that you're saying what you need to say accurately. But your other half is to gauge the jury and make sure that you're providing an effective testimony. Because if you're putting people to sleep, you've got a problem, because they're not hearing what information that will be very valuable to the case that they need to make determinations about. So collect all of the information, present it in a simple and easy to understand way, and document the authentication in a conservative way. So when you're generating reports, don't try to stuff every single possible thing that's going to satisfy what an expert wants to say to the court based on all of the work that they've done. Only include what's really necessary so that the court can make determinations. External and internal peer review of opinion reports is necessary. So if we're providing an opinion in a report, it needs to be peer reviewed either by someone in my organization that has similar qualifications, or a colleague at another firm, to ensure that the information and the opinions that I am presenting are accurate. Practitioners should report the observed features, including those that support the specified conclusion. So again, as we look to what's relevant in testimony, you know, making sure that what you're talking about is relevant to the case or what you were asked to do. And conclusions should not be reported as statistical probability. We're seeing this more and more and more. And our training and our organizations that we seek guidance from in the scientific community are cautioning us not to do this, because although you may be confident in the percentages that you arrive at, they may not be accurate because they're not based on the correct type of data to interpret that information. So we are trained to look to a confidence scale. And this is a scale that's being used in the UK as well as other parts of the world. And now it's being used more in courts in the United States. And this was presented to me at my last training through LEVA, which is the Law Enforcement and Emergency Services Video Association. They are in my opinion, the world's leading organization in video forensic analysis. And they approach things in an even deeper level to forensic analysis that I really appreciate. And instead of trying to arrive at an opinion based on a percentage, what we have to do is look to this scale and to determine whether or not what we are providing in terms of an opinion based on the analysis lends support or doesn't to whatever question that we were asked. And this is very important when we look to image analysis, such as comparing images, authenticating them, etc. This is also known as the likelihood scale, or the scale of conclusions. So now we're going to look to a case study. The moment we've all been waiting for. What does an investigation like this look like for the trier of fact? So I'm going to be presenting this information about a client that I was working for anonymously. However, the attorney client that I was working with has authorized me to share this information about the case, and his name is Mr. Chris Kessel out of Detroit, Michigan. So I want to give a shout out to him. He is one of the best litigators that I have worked with for trial, especially with this type of specific science. He was very thorough when we were in preparation as well as in testimony. And the case study we're going to be examining is screenshots of an email used as evidence. So what was I asked to do? I was asked to authenticate these emails that were allegedly sent from a specific type of device, authenticate the screenshot that was taken on a phone that was used as evidence in the case and submitted to law enforcement, verify the integrity of the screenshot, examine all discovery documentation, so all of the police reports, witness statements, things like that, and then examine all of the client's devices, the defendant's devices, to try to locate any traces of these emails, and then present the investigation and opinions in court. Now, I cannot take all the credit for this portion of the investigation, the data collection, as well as the analysis. I oftentimes work with a partner company, Garrett Discovery, Brian Bowman and Andrew Garrett over at Garrett Discovery, and they are the leading organization in digital forensic analysis of mobile devices as well as computers. And we oftentimes work on cases as partners and contract that way. So we actually contracted Garrett Discovery to analyze these devices to ensure that no traces, or to actually determine if there was traces or not traces of the emails, so that we could authenticate this picture in addition to. And we found no traces. That was ultimately what we found. So the investigation began with a screenshot, and I'm going to show that screenshot, well, several screenshots, and I'm going to show those in a moment. But we began by looking at the police reports. And the police reports identified that law enforcement observed screenshots of these emails that were allegedly sent from a mobile device with threatening statements. And the client or the defendant was charged accordingly. What was troublesome about this investigation, again, as I begin to present about this case study from the defense perspective, my opinions and my analysis is meant to be taken as objective. I'm not speaking ill of law enforcement. That is not my intention. I work with law enforcement often, and I'm trained by law enforcement, and I respect their job and what they do. However, in this particular case, they simply did not do their due diligence in collecting this evidence accurately and providing it to the court. So essentially what they did was they observed a screenshot of a picture of an email. And when we look at that, there is essentially no digital integrity to that screenshot. It's a picture of an email. It's not the email itself. And when we're authenticating emails, there is information embedded in that email that is necessary to verify its integrity, such as the date and time it was sent, the contact that it was sent from, or the email address, maybe even the server that it originated from, or what kind of email server it was sent from. And that was simply not here because we were examining a picture. To make matters worse, there were indications about this image. This is one of the screenshots that was used as evidence that clearly did not have any kind of integrity. We don't have any kind of cell phone provider information. So oftentimes in the upper left-hand corner of a cell phone, this is an example of an iPhone, we would expect to see what type of service was used or being used at that time that this image was captured on for that cell phone. As well as the indication that this email, which was listed from a contact, as you see there's a TM there, which we assume is the contact of the defendant, does not clearly, I mean, it's showing that it came from a junk mailbox. So you would suspect, okay, if this was a email that was sent from someone in my known contacts, why would it go to my junk? And the reality of this type of investigation, as we look at these things, and I testified about this in many cases, is that everything can be faked, especially email information can be faked. And I've personally tested this using spoofing services. And if you guys aren't familiar with spoofing services, essentially you can send an email and represent it as someone else's information, but originate it from a different sender. And one of the common services that you can do that through is called Spoofbox. And one of their services that they offer is spoofing an email. And again, it's the ability to change the sender address when you send mail. And not that I'm claiming that this was done in this particular case, but it was a very real possibility. And without that digital information about that email, that original digital information about that email, we simply can't verify where it came from or who sent it. Therefore, it's not an authentic representation of the events. And the screenshot that was interpreted and analyzed is not an authentic representation of the events. This particular service also does a lot of different types of spoofing. It spoofs emails, texts, calls, fax, chat, even WhatsApp information. And it even has the option to fake an image's location. So now when we're talking about image authentication, we can provide an image to the trier of fact and fake its location if not properly authenticated with a simple uploading of a few dollars to this type of service. And there are many other services to be able to do this. So as we're talking about image authentication, we're talking about digital integrity verification. We're talking about email signatures. We're talking about all these types of data. So what would that email signature have looked like, or an example of it for us to be able to analyze and verify integrity of? Something like this is an example, and this is kind of a quick example that I tried to throw together because I didn't have any other examples of email headers, but this was a bill that I sent to my Netflix account, which is kind of necessary during these times to be able to watch Netflix. And as you see, there's an example of the header from PayPal that was sent to me. Actually, this is a receipt. This is not the actual payment. And what we're looking at here is date and times, security protocols, the actual email that it was sent from and sent to. All of these things help us to verify the integrity. And as we look at this image, none of that information is present. And this was actually provided to me in a paper document. So we didn't even have the actual digital screenshot, the image that we could have analyzed. None of that information was available. What we had was a different format, which also reduced the integrity of the picture. So an example of what authentic information of a screenshot would look like, this is an example that I photographed on my cell phone. It supplies indicators from a metadata perspective that tells us what type of device created it, the display profile, et cetera, et cetera. It even tells us in the user comment that it was a screenshot because I captured it on my phone. This is all information that we would have expected to analyze. So let's say they submitted the screenshot. At least we could have verified the integrity of that potentially. But in this particular case, we didn't even have that information. So to recap on the authentication analysis, no camera original information was provided. No digital information to verify the integrity was provided. No chain of custody documentation was provided about how that evidence was essentially handled. And the police reports clearly stated that they examined a screenshot on the device and didn't go deeper. And in my opinion, any investigator should have or has a due diligence to exhaust all options, leave no stone unturned, and to potentially look into the emails on the complainant's phone to verify what was sent or how it was sent, et cetera. So my opinions. These were opinions that I provided to the courts. This was a case right out of Detroit, Michigan, as I stated previously, that I testified in for about an hour and a half. And it was essentially that the imagery that was provided was not a authentic representation of the events as they occurred because the integrity couldn't be verified. And the court, I recommended, should not interpret the information within those images or take them as fact, because we don't know the circumstances to which how they were sent in regards to the emails or who sent them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my testimony, and then we're going to have some time for questions. So as I testified, I was qualified as a digital forensic expert. And this was actually the first time I testified where I was asked a lot of questions by the jury. In particular, 5 rounds of questions where the jury submitted questions, and then they come around to the judge, and then the judge reads them. And this was also the first time in which I was scolded by a judge, which I thought was kind of comical, because I was trying to maintain eye contact with the jury as well as the judge. So my head was kind of going back and forth. But he essentially told me, hey, the jury's going to be making the decision. You don't need to look at me, look at them, explain things. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And again, I was asked a lot of questions, which was impressive because, as you begin to explain these things to the court and you explain them to a jury and you run through all of the digital mumbo jumbo, you don't expect them to be extremely receptive of everything. And they asked some really, really good questions. And ultimately, at the end of the case, the client's charges were dismissed. I believe that had a lot to do with this particular evidence that was being used to convict them, mainly because we couldn't authenticate it, and that was the reality of the case. So at this time, we're going to open it up for questions. I'm going to open my screen up where we've got the any list of questions, or you can submit questions through the Q&A. I want to thank you for your time and your attention to listen to what I have to say about this particular science, image authentication, and a case study that I provided right here in our home in Detroit, Michigan. Thank you, Detroit Bar, for your willingness to promote this and to send it to your agency to listen in and learn more about what we do on a daily basis. And if I don't get to all of your questions, I do want to say, please email me at this email address, mike@primeaucompanies.com. So if we don't have time to answer all of them, I will make sure that I answer your questions that you submit via email. So if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. So we have a question about metadata and potentially some confusion with that explanation. So I'm just going to recap on what metadata is from a little bit of a simpler perspective. So metadata is information about a digital file that essentially tells us to which the circumstances to that file were created, such as date and time, the file name, maybe a location that file was created, GPS information associated with that file, as well as when we're talking about imagery, the image size, maybe how the camera lens was photographing that picture when it captured it at that time. All of that information can be dissected, interpreted, and then compared against with knowns to be able to interpret that information further. So another question we have is that, can you describe how to enter evidence on cell phone of rent payments made through Cash App? Seems sort of like your Netflix example. Do you need an expert? So something like entering evidence from a Cash App would probably require some sort of in-depth analysis when we're talking about authentication of that information. Now, if there are records of how that transaction took place via the Cash App outside of the actual app's information, that could accompany the information that could be collected from the phone. And oftentimes, anything that's submitted from a phone regarding digital information does need to be collected, unless you have something very specific that says this transaction came from this person on this specific time, and you really don't need to go further into the app. However, if you don't have that information, let's say you don't have access to bank records or any of that kind of thing, there is a simple way that information could be collected either by law enforcement or by an expert like myself or my partner company that I mentioned earlier, Garrett Discovery. There are lots of ways that information can be collected in a cost-effective manner. And if it needs to be analyzed further, then we can enter an investigation. But we can simply gather that information or extract that information and generate a report for the court to then interpret. The next question, if I understand, the court gives the jury the expert witness instruction, and it's up to the jury to decide whether to accept it and whether the document is authentic. Is that what happened in this case study? So yes and no. In this particular case, yes, the court was given, the court gives the jury the expert witness instruction, and yes, they can determine whether or not they want to accept what information I'm going to be providing and interpret that about the document. And that was what happened in this particular case. I was entered as an expert, and that information was presented to the court, and they did rely upon it based on my understanding of how the case ended to make their decision. Another question. When working with medical records, we often see that the document was edited by so-and-so and such a time. However, when we pull audit trails, we as attorneys are left more confused. Is this something that your office is able to help dig through? What information should we as attorneys be requesting in order for you to do a complete study? So when we're looking at medical records, I'm going to echo my question, or I'm going to echo this question back just to make sure I understand it completely. Medical records in digital form, or are they medical records in printed form? What type of medical records are we looking at? Digital format. This would be more of a expertise for my partner firm, Garrett Discovery, to examine digital files. Yes, we could intake them for you and examine them on a preliminary basis to determine if there's something even forensic analysis could do to assist. So oftentimes when we're doing investigations, the first step is we take what's called a preliminary investigation. And we use an hour of our time and just assess whatever evidence we need to assess to determine if there's something we can even do to help. Because in most cases, as a business as well as experts, we don't want to enter a case if we don't think that there's something that we're going to be able to help the investigation or help the trier of fact. So a preliminary analysis could reveal if there was malicious manipulation of that information, or if the information that was edited was done from a, let's say, a sanitization standpoint, or an attempt to discard irrelevant information and preserve relevant information. So yes, digital forensic analysis could assist with that. The next question, Detroit Project Greenlight videos. Can images be enhanced, magnified to see facial features and other identifying information? Yes. Image enhancement techniques can reveal facial features, although CSI has kind of painted a picture in our culture that you can just click a button and then everything goes enhance, and we can clearly see the details of the individual, and we can clearly identify a marking on their face. And that isn't always the case. We have a term when we're talking about imagery and digital media: garbage in, garbage out. So if the recording created by the Greenlight Project was insufficient in terms of quality standards, we may not be able to improve the clarity of that imagery to reveal information with a guarantee. So it really depends on the quality of the imagery in the video. It depends on what format was extracted. So in digital video, there are two types of major formats of information or video recordings that are extracted. We have courtroom ready, which is a recording that's very easily playable on multiple formats. And then we have what's called a proprietary. A proprietary recording requires a specialized player to access it, and oftentimes is a higher quality version, because if the person extracting the courtroom ready version compresses it, which can very often happen in these digital video recording systems, that information could be lost. But in a proprietary version, if often preserved, we may have more information that we can use to enhance the imagery or analyze the imagery, et cetera, if preserved. So we encourage our clients when we're doing this type of work to file motions to preserve the original system, evidence, or even to contact whatever association. In this particular case, Greenlight would be, I think it's Detroit Police, to ensure that they have the highest quality version available for analysis or even forensic analysis. Any other questions? Another question that we have: how should an attorney present Greenlight? What type of monitor? I'm going to make sure that I understand the question. Is this in regards to presentation in court as an exhibit? Yes, okay. There are a lot of different ways that you can present recordings, but the component at its core, when we're examining or trying to determine how to present something, is, does the picture size that came in as native, is it being represented in the same way in court? So if you're looking at something that was large on a potentially different resolution on a monitor, it's going to look different, and you're not going to see specific details that you may have saw in your office that need to be displayed properly in court. One of the best ways that I recommend, if the court doesn't have proper playback equipment, is to simply rent a projector. a projector system or like a pop-up screen with a projector. You know, some firms may even have one because they are, if the right kind of projector is chosen, they have a high resolution and they're very bright. So they have the right amount of lumens to be able to display that light level for an accurate representation. If you're using monitoring, I would recommend something LED. LED is again, a brighter, higher quality picture with a high color space. If we are talking about presenting it as an exhibit, typically flash drives are how I present things like that. But again, it's just like even when you're printing a picture, the picture size that you're intaking or presenting must be the same in terms of your output. Similar situation with audio. If you were presenting an audio recording that you listen to on a high quality system and identified certain things, you wouldn't want to play it from your cell phone in court. You would want a high quality playback, something that can represent that accurately. Does that answer your question? I also wanted to make a note that this presentation will be posted on YouTube, our YouTube channel, and we will be sending that out to the Detroit bar as well as anyone here from the Michigan bar to be able to view later, and it will be made public. So in case you missed it or you want to send it to a colleague or something like that, we will make that available for circulation. Any other questions about image analysis, image authentication, things like that? Maybe the case study? Yes, jurors like to increase magnification while watching the video on laptop in the jury room. This seems to present a problem. Absolutely, it presents a problem. So when you're zooming on anything, that principle is called pixel interpolation. Pixel interpolation, if done improperly, will affect the pixel integrity in a negative way. So on some platforms, when you're zooming, essentially what you're doing is stretching the pixels. And that's not going to provide an accurate representation of what they originally represented. They must be enhanced or clarified. Now, in some proprietary video systems, they have pixel interpolation methods when you zoom in on a video from a surveillance system that are accurate, and you can use that correctly. However, if they're simply stretching something like even you can do on your phone to make something bigger, that pixel interpolation method may be affecting the integrity or the authenticity of the events. And if the video is that bad of quality, it may need to be clarified forensically, or it may need to be resized forensically. And I'm not saying that you have to hire somebody like me to do that. I'm saying that whatever agency presented it should have the means to enlarge it, enhance it, clarify it, etc., to ensure that what is being shown is an accurate representation. That's a very good question, and we see that often, which is why we clarify recordings on a regular basis, also to make sure that it's done accurately. Because when, let's say, a jury is assessing some sort of characteristic about a suspect or something within the video, and they're essentially altering that information by stretching it or making it bigger to make it represent something that it didn't before, that can be dangerous to a case. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to throw my contact information back up on the screen. Hopefully everybody can see this. If you have any additional questions or maybe questions about the webinar or questions about a case, please don't hesitate to contact us. We above all else, as a company, we want to act as a resource to the trier of fact to make sure that they understand this information and these types of sciences accurately, because they are very applicable to cases that have digital media or digital evidence in general, because there is so much of it. And so many people have the ability to capture that information and present it to the trier of fact. So thank you for your time. Again, thank you for all for being here. We very much appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of you virtually during this time on Zoom. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. And again, just to reiterate, this recording, this presentation, will be uploaded to YouTube, and we will circulate that shortly in case you want to rewatch it or send it to someone else, or maybe the people at home that didn't get a chance to join on with us live. So.